I first became interested in all things Gothic 13 years ago. I learned that the Goth subculture was formerly dated as an 80s phenomenon, yet always suspected that the essence of this movement might lie somewhat deeper, embedded in the timeless cultural subconscious. In recent years, I noticed the rising prominence of dark aesthetics in film, TV, fashion, and modern literature. In turn, I have decided to interview scholars and writers to investigate if there is indeed a Gothic revival in the 21st century, and if so, why Gothic aesthetics have re-emerged in contemporary culture.
I think I've noticed an increase, especially in the last few years. Things like the girl with the dragon tattoo, H&M did a fashion line that seemed really popular, and now they did a collaboration with, I think it was Alice Dalal, and now every year they've almost got this permanent sort of goth alternative section in there, and I've not seen that until the past 2 years. Every winter now you see it more and more sort of in fashion, in high street fashion, even all the sort of the vampire films, all the Twilight stuff, and all kind of films of that ilk became more and more popular, and I think vampire and goth culture is quite intertwined, so it's all kind of helped each other grow. I've definitely seen it more, sort of around more than I did when I first moved to London, definitely.
There's been a resurgence in the Gothic field of filmmaking lately, starting off with Tim Burton's films, which really rehashes of his characters and tropes used in the 80s and 90s, stemming from Edward Scissorhands, and it's been reinvented now with the likes of Sweeney Todd, Corpse Bride, and those sort of movies, in particular Dark Shadows, which again is rehashed characters from the 60s. But Hollywood seem to be making the films because they see the market in it, due to the preparation and the right. Universal movies in particular have decided to remake quite a few of their old monster movies populated in the 30s, 40s and 50s, with the likes of Wolfman, and a whole new series, a slew of movies with a Van Helsing character, originally a Hammer trope. Hammer themselves have also started to remake some of the old movies, not so much traditional Hammer films, but remakes of ghost stories. For instance, Woman in Black was actually one of their most profitable movies they've ever made, which was just recently remade. And they're going in that direction again and rewriting the film Woman in Black 2, which is due for release next year.
We find now we have one of the country's only Gothic Masters programmes, the MA English Studies, the Gothic. We find no trouble in recruiting to that. There is a mass popular interest in the Gothic, and we offer individual units on that MA as what's called a CPD course. So you can take it as a standalone course. And again, you know, we have large numbers of people taking those. We also offer an online MA, which enables people from all over the country and indeed all over that. And there's an enormous popular interest with people who don't have access to Gothic studies wherever they happen to be. So yeah, we're very excited about that. I think the Gothic has always been a mode that enables us to question the society that we live in, the ways in which that society constructs us as human beings, and the ways in which that capacity has the power to challenge us and potentially to destroy us. So I think there's no coincidence that the Gothic has become so phenomenally popular over the course of the last 20 years or so, because we've seen seismic changes in global geopolitics. We've seen the fall of the Eastern Bloc, we've seen the triumph of neoliberal capitalism, and we've seen the devastation that has caused to traditional communities and ways of life. And I think the Gothic, in its focus on destruction and loss and the decay of the body, the fragmentation of the social self, is a fantastic means of interrogating social change, particularly as in the present, when large swathes of the world's population are being deemed as somehow less than human by the ongoing march of corporatism across the planet. Why, we may ask ourselves, has the zombie become the monster of our generation? The American zombie economy alone is estimated at turning over $5 billion a year. That's a lot of money. It's TV programming, it's films, it's costumes, it's zombie marches, it's zombie games. The zombie somehow speaks to our contemporary condition as neoliberal subjects. and the devastated cities of zombie Gothic are remarkably redolent of cities like Detroit in the United States, where industrial production's moved on, and people are left, former industrial workers, shambling about in the ruins of their former lives. It's a powerful metaphor, I think, for the social dislocations of our age.
Since the dawn of film, we've also had a huge interest in horror cinema. It has come in peaks and troughs, but it's definitely always been with us. We've always wanted to try and capture that experience of the monster on screen. So in relation to our work here at the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies, we're looking at this increased interest and increased phenomenon around monsters in Gothic studies. I think the zombie narrative in the last 30, 40 years really have kind of stood in for the disassociation, cultural and social disassociation we have felt in relation to those who govern and rule us. The vampire has become very articulate in the last 40 years and is trying to narrate his own particular space within the cultural imagination. So vampires were previously kept in cold dark castles out beyond Romania, and now they seem to be everywhere within our popular culture. They are our neighbours, our lovers, our best friends. So something very interesting is occurring there, where the vampire narrative is actually standing in for all of our sense of alienation and mimics, or indeed apes, political and social narratives in the period as well. So they're very particular to the periods in which they are, the stories are located. So for example, you have vampires in the 1970s are usually articulating something to do with sexual identity, coming out of the closet, that kind of thing, or indeed becoming the other lovers who are competing against existing people in the social circle of the female protagonist. But in the 2000s, we tend to find that vampires are split into two very distinct groups. The first being ones who are hyper-violent and searching for things like resources. If you look at films like Daybreakers, for instance, which is really an oil narrative. Or if you look at something like Twilight, which is really to do with the rise of evangelical religious right movements in the vampire narrative under George W. Bush. So it's very distinctly split through political and social super narratives, essentially, that inform the vampire. I think the vampire myth is as old as we are. You know, I mean, the idea of living forever goes back to Lazarus, the idea of being resurrected. So it's within our very mythology that, you know, the idea of outlasting death and the romance that is involved with that. It's not always necessarily portrayed romantically, but there is a romance with outliving your time or having an unnatural length of time on Earth. So going back to folklore, going back to mythology, you get this idea that, you know, somehow we are able to supersede the limited skin and flesh in which we inhabit, or we are inhabited. So it's interesting then when we come back to the popular culture representation of it, that our vampires tend to become younger on screen and younger in film. From the 1970s, there were usually actors portraying vampires in their 30s and their 40s, and now it's vampires usually in their mid-teens onwards. And so this idea of eternal youth is very explicitly encoded onto the screen, and usually also white vampires as well. It tends to be taking on that kind of social mores of what is desired beauty and youth, and that is projected onto the vampire narrative quite explicitly in recent films. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is driven by consumerist narratives. It is, and a lot of the vampire narratives the last 15 years are all really invested in that consumerist agenda. Vampires don't tend to be impoverished. They tend to be incredibly wealthy because they have a lot of time to essentially gather that wealth and to have the most consumerist, neoliberal, desired life that popular culture kind of presents. So it's quite interesting to think that the vampire is the hyper-consumer. He's the consumer not only of people but of goods and services as well.
It's gone concurrently to its, if you like, academic institutionalization, in the sense that up until the 80s, I guess, more explicitly in the 90s, the Gothic was not really, or was only beginning to be taken seriously at an academic level. And I think it's subsuming, if you like, of other areas, you know, like steampunk, like the weird, for example, even of horror, which you know, has kind of like been taken over by this Gothic label, so that, you know, you now talk about Gothic horror. There is an interest in it because it's finally taken to be the kind of serious academic study that, for example, Linnie was talking about. And I think it allows us as a label to study pretty much everything that is not socially normative. So in a way, it's taken over this kind of, if you like, touch of transgression that I think has been interest to a lot of academics, but also has allowed a lot of fans, for example, to kind of like feel justified in their liking of certain texts. It has allowed us, for example, to see value in series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It goes through phases. I mean, I guess from the turn of the century we have had a few, if you like, areas of interest, or rather, if you like, strands of horror that have developed. Some of them are more Gothic than others. So, for example, you've got something like torture porn, which I've written about and have had an interest in, which is, if you like, very much takes over the corporeal side of the Gothic, and kind of going back to things like inquisitorial torture and turning that into the heart of the action. But there's other strands like found footage, which really has gone back, if you like, to the paranormal, ghostly, haunting kind of side of the Gothic and done something different with it. Linnie and I have just finished editing a collection on this particular area. So it's really interesting to see how the Gothic has allowed us, through film, to very much kind of investigate areas about, or concerns, if you like, about the digital era. So I guess it's manifested in many ways. I think it's harder to speak of a specifically Gothic strand within cinema, unless we're talking aesthetically, films that go back, if you like The Woman in Black. Like they literally go back, but I would argue that the Gothic has expanded beyond that, and that you can find it in other strands of horror, especially if we focus on what film does rather than what it looks like. There's many reasons why people like the Gothic, and they're not necessarily always the same reason. So I think the reason why academics like the Gothic, for example, is that it allows them to talk about, if you like, repressed areas of society, of culture, of sexuality, of gender. I think there's another strand that we haven't really talked about, which is what's being called Happy Gothic, which is this kind of like, if you like, celebratory, unashamed form of the Gothic that very much revels on its surface. Very postmodern kind of celebration of the Gothic that people like purely because they like it aesthetically. I'm thinking of things like Emily Lestrange or the films of Tim Burton more specifically. Films that don't necessarily or don't set out to transgress, but that just look dark. I think there's always been an interest in things that are dark, throughout the ages, because I don't know. I think they're more personally. I think they're more playful. They allow us to feel a bit more different. So yeah, I'd say there's various types of Gothic according to how you experience it and whether you're thinking about it as a critical tool.
And Gothic's never gone away. One of the big things is people talk about goth being back in fashion and Gothic being in fashion. The truth is it's never gone away. All the time we just seem to have these Gothic revivals, but in actual fact there is a goth scene and there is a lot of interest in Gothic, and it's always bubbling away, and then every now and again it'll just sort of peak again. Somebody will come along with something, whether it's a fashion designer, for example, Alexander McQueen, who's got a wonderful exhibition at the V&A. He was very, very influenced by Gothic, and so a lot of his collections were Gothic, and since his death as well, his house have created more Gothic couture. Then you can have films, Tim Burton, for example, whenever he brings out a new movie, that seems to pique interest, and Guillermo del Toro as well, he's another one. So Goth is always there. There's so many people influenced by Gothic. It's just, I guess, when somebody comes along with something, everybody gets enthusiastic in the mainstream, but in that underground, it never goes away. The Gothic aesthetic has always been there, and what it really takes is for just somebody to suddenly get interested in it and bring it up to the mainstream. One of the interesting things about American Horror Story is the fact that the creators were people behind Glee, which is about the most un-Gothic thing that you could possibly imagine. But it's almost like they did this sort of light, fluffy, twee thing, and they needed something dirty and dark to get the light and fluffiness out of the system. I think, with a lot of people, it's light and dark, it's balance, and I think it's just an intrinsic part of human nature. You need that balance, and that is what creating something incredibly dark when you're used to doing something incredibly light is. It's all about balancing it out. With the rise of Hammer horror, the new House of Hammer, when they were creating things like Woman in Black and also the Quiet Ones, again, Hammer have always been there with Gothic. They've always embraced that in terms of horror. And I think it was wonderful that they decided to come up with A Woman in Black and basically revive Susan Hill's incredible ghost story. I'm a big Susan Hill fan. She's a wonderful, wonderful author. And Woman in Black has been turned into plays in the past, and it was brilliant to just bring it to a fresh audience with somebody like Daniel Radcliffe as the big star. And of course now we've got Woman in Black 2, which is just a continuation of that, although it's not connected to Susan Hill's book. But it's going back to that thing of human interest and human nature being drawn towards the macabre and being drawn towards darker things. And so you kind of know that if you're going to create something that's that little bit dark, that's got other ingredients in there, it will appeal to people, it will appeal to the mainstream, and of course it's going to appeal to goths as well, because, you know, we love all that.